Thank you, Kalani. That was lovely. Well, it's okay. I'd like to begin by talking about the structure of your book. You write very brief, non-chronological chapters, and the chapter titles felt almost like guideposts to me. I'm going to read a few of my favorites. Katya dreams of her son, phrases on Euromaidan protest posters, how to make love to a man not your husband. These chapters allowed me to feel fully present in their brevity, I think. I also love the variety of the style of the chapters. We get so many things, right? We get news headlines, poems, folklore. I'm just going to go on. Tape recordings, scenes, of course, with our main characters, lists of the dead. I wonder if you could talk about your choice to take this collagist approach with the structure. What informed the structure, and what did you intend for the structure to convey?
So, it was a couple of things. I think that there were a lot of things I wanted to cover in the book that I couldn't find the way to do very easily through like just a straightforward narrative. So if I was going to tell the story of the missing journalists, for example, there's Dasha's story, but I wanted to sort of make sure that the reader knew that this was a thing at Maidan, like this was a problem, and still is in many countries. Even the United States has become more violent against journalists. But the best way that I found to do that was to sort of experiment and to try different things. And with there's certain sections, like you mentioned, with Katya Dreams of Her Son, that have sort of like a longer title. I didn't take very much poetry in my MFA program, but one thing that I did learn is the power of that title. And so, I mean, titles are really important to me. This title was really important to me of the book, and so each opportunity that I could find to sort of like clue in the reader to like where they were to, it's a place that not very many like American readers are going to be super familiar with unless they, have Eastern European heritage, and so it was a way for me to sort of inform them on their setting, drop them into a scene that they don't know where they're going or where they're going next. And that's kind of like my strategic thinking behind it. The other part of it is that I would get stuck writing. So there were things that I decided to do with form that were mostly like a result of not being sure how to progress to the next point. Much of the book was like, I wrote like I wrote all of the narratives like first, like straight through for each of the main characters. And then everything else, like as I was filling in the book, kind of came like after and continued to like develop. So it was sort of like this amalgamation of like all of those things.
I love how you talk about it being like a breakthrough as a writer, like helping you get through writing it, because I feel like often the breakthroughs we have through writers are like what is also a breakthrough for the reader. But I just wanted to go back to I thought it was the structure was so reader friendly. I definitely appreciated that, being someone who did not know much about this at all before we started. But I also felt the structure of these chapters like enacted this experience of processing trauma as someone who's experienced that, right? So we get these brief chapters and the events are revealed like non-linearly. So I felt as if I was like processing the trauma of these events along with the characters. So I really appreciated that. Also, I love how it is in 2 parts. I'm just geeking out here. I'm a writer, so I'm going to talk about the structure a little more. How it was in part 1 and part 2, right? So in part 1, we mainly get the events of Maidan. And then in part 2, we get the aftermath of it, as well as way before, right? Soviet Union, Chernobyl, etc. And I just felt that that part of it, of the structure, felt very true. Because I feel like when we have traumatic events like this, there is this divide It's like what happened before and what happened after, and I've experienced that as well, like pre and post Katrina's my life. But I so love the structure of this book. I want to talk more about the structure, but I want to talk about the Kobzari, which I know is like a fan favorite from what I've read so far. The Greek chorus, they're the Greek chorus of your book. They serve as minstrels, as the historians of the book, and I love the refrain. Would you mind doing it for me? No. I'll just do it again. I hope I'm doing it right. I like think of the count when I do it. Okay, thank you. But how the and how the Kobzari, this language pivoted towards a shift in understanding our greater truth. So we have these Kobzari sections, but then we have the Kobzari slipping into the narration from different characters. So could you talk about what inspired using the Kobzari in your work and how you see them functioning? Do you see them as narrators, etc.?
Yes. So this has like actually been, I've done a couple other entries, and yeah, this is totally something that I'm really excited because the Kobzari sections were originally like, I mean, many of them are like in verse, and so that was something that $2 Radio was sort of like, I don't know if we should keep it in verse, you know, should we turn this into prose instead? The structure might like freak people out, which like understandable, I guess, you know. But I felt really strongly about it being in mostly verse because these, well, first of all, I love like Greek epics. So the Odyssey has always been one of like those like stories that has just always stuck with me. So I've always wanted to write my own sort of like epic, and I never knew if I was like capable of it. And this voice kind of came out of, originally the Kobzari was like an extension of Alexander's voice, who is a character in the book that is very philosophical and sort of meanders throughout the book as, you know, reflective and that sort of thing. But it didn't quite feel right, and once the voice sort of emerged as its own singular thing, I was constantly doing research on the book throughout every stage of writing it, and I was learning about the Kobzari and their role in Ukraine and how they were, like how Stalin wanted to essentially exterminate them, which was part of the book that I read tonight. And I think that just like the lyrical voice and those oral traditions, you know, are so easily wiped out, forgotten, and it became an important thing to keep in the book and to recognize in the story. And those sections did, I think, like it all. Kobzari also sort of functions as like a voice of Ukraine in some ways. And what I was hoping and what ended up happening, you know, I'm glad that like smart readers could catch that it did slip into like, you know, these other narratives, because it becomes a point where you might be in Misha's perspective, but then all of a sudden it'll slip into like this all-knowing voice of Ukraine, and it's speaking about not just Misha's experience, but everybody who's experiencing trauma or this horrible event at Euromaidan. So it was a really, it's hard to, there's certain parts of the book where I don't even feel like I wrote it, you know? And that's definitely one of the parts where it feels like, you know, I read it and I'm like, I don't know where that came from.
Being the body experience.
Yeah, I look at it and I'm like, wow, like, dope. You know? So, yeah, but yeah, it was like, once I, you know, caught hold of it, and you know, Eric and Eliza from $2 Radio like also was like really loved it, and there were parts where we filled it out to have more of a presence with it, to encase as much of like the history of Ukraine as we could. So I think that, like you were talking about with traumatic experiences, Ukraine's had a very fraught history, and as I was writing this book, it was sort of in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, I'm writing this, and it's because I'm moved by the story, but how could, with all this research that I'm doing, and all these things that I'm understanding about Ukrainian history, the reader of this book is not going to understand the scope of this conflict if they also don't have an understanding of the history. And so once I started to just read more, and these journalistic voices came in, the Kobzari voice came in, it just really fleshed out the book in a way that I'd hoped it ultimately would. It's very much like the story of these four people intersecting at Maidan, but it's also a story about this history of Ukraine and the ongoing conflict, and how this trauma keeps repeating.
So speaking of the Kobzari, I'm wondering if you would read a specific Kobzari section for us tonight. It's very short. It's May Day 1986 on page 160. This section speaks to the generations of suffering of the Ukrainian people, which I'd like for us to talk a bit more about. So you could read that section.
If you already have the hard.
Oh, sorry. Yes, this is the paper. Sorry.
She has the condensed version. So it's on page 164. May Day 1986. Wow. 1986. Sung by Kobzari. We evacuated our homes, holding bundles. Our men collapsed like horses. It is not the first time. On May Day in Kiev, there is still a parade. Women smile, flowers in their hair, ribbons and posters, raised arms, everywhere Lenin. We watch it on television while rubbing the backs of our children as they vomit paste into a bucket. Our husbands shovel the reactive waste, their skin blackened, faces puffed. The cracked skin, pink flesh peeling like split fruit. Tastes like metal, our children say, while treated for cancers. Some of the old ones return home, tending familiar soil, eating mushrooms, canning jams. They live for decades. They flourish. What's so bad about it? The old ones ask. Water is just as fresh. Berries just as sweet. We, those who have moved away, in anguish say, not even the famine killed us, not even the war, and oh, now we will die alone in a foreign land.
I cried the first time I read that, and the second. That is so poignant, and I so appreciate you reading it. In this single page and just a few lines in my version, the Kobzari remind us of the Ukrainian famine, the reign of the Soviet Union, and how they celebrated May Day anyway after the Chernobyl disaster, the visceral and horrific aftermath of that disaster. Could you talk about your choice to contextualize Euromaidan within this long history of suffering in Ukraine, especially including Chernobyl as well?
So I started off at the Euromaidan by watching a documentary that, so that was my entrance into this whole history. And so I feel that, the way that the people reacted to their government and the violence that took place on the people that were protesting was, I think, a complete shock to them. And in other ways, it was kind of not a surprise. And I think that, in the context of writing this book, I started this book in 2016, and it was, I remember being in a novel writing class with Matt Bell, And, we were, there came a point in class where we sort of the class sort of unraveled because we were dealing with the election at that time, and that was the 2016 Trump election. And so for me, in the context of writing this book, it was I think that sometimes we can underestimate how important the president can be in the United States. Not just our president, it's a president that affects us on a global level. And so for, having this context of the Euromaidan protests in 2014, and then here we are 2 years later, and Trump's become president, and he's has a good relationship with Putin. That caused a lot of anxiety for Ukrainians because, at that time, Russia had invaded Ukraine and taken back Crimea, and there was a war going on in the eastern part of our country. And so that's really scary for people. And I think as a country that has a long history of being, bullied around by, Russia, it was just another, even though Euromaidan in particular wasn't a Russian sort of, moment initially, it became one very quickly with the invasion from Russia later on. And in that particular section of the book, when you look at the history, I guess, it's just repeatedly, how many times are you going to be sort of gaslighted, gaslit, into thinking that your history isn't happening, like Stalin eradicating all of the, or trying to eradicate all of the Khazari, and that this Ukrainian history didn't exist, all Ukrainian texts are being eradicated. The Holodomor with, Ukrainian people being starved, a man-made genocide by Stalin, and then you have now this situation in Ukraine where you have Russians coming in and saying oh, we're not here, that's not us, it's Ukrainians fighting against Ukrainians. It just, Chernobyl happens and it gets kind of swept under the rug and it's hidden, and real people are being affected by that. So I think that in just that one poem, it's just it was a moment there to look at the people who were pushed out of their homes during Chernobyl and caused to resettle elsewhere in the country. And the study that I had read is that those people who were pushed out of their homes suffered in emotionally, health-wise, but the people that ended up turning back and returning to Chernobyl, even though it is a radioactive mess, were outliving people who had been exiled. And I found that super fascinating. And I think that it's just a powerful story for these people to constantly be fighting for home and what it means for them. And yeah.
Well, as a reader, I especially appreciated you contextualizing your mind on the larger tragedies that are going on. And that makes me think on a smaller scale of how you contextualize the grief in your characters' lives, which I appreciated. It was never just this singular grief going on. Every single one of your characters had 2 to 3 to 4 tragic things happen to them before Euromaidan. And for me, I saw that larger historical context reflected in that, and I felt that so much, so I appreciated it. So we've alluded to this a lot, but I would like to dive in to this sense of displacement that all of the primary characters in this book experience, and the title concept of dying in a foreign land. this really resonated with me as someone who has felt displaced, especially experiencing this type of loss is something that you feel in your body, quite literally. This feeling of drowning or being underwater, like I talked about before, or just a sudden feeling of disorientation. Several times your characters are like, where am I? I was especially drawn to some of these moments of cause and effect. The characters thinking, what if Katya's son hadn't died, Katya, sorry, would she be here? Would she be in Ukraine? Or if Misha's father hadn't died, would he have married Vera? So could you talk about your choice to position these characters as displaced, every single one of them, and how that ties into your title? And if you could just talk about your title a little bit, because I know it was referenced in the Kabzari section we read.
Yeah, so the title was sort of like a beacon, I think, for the book. There was this song that was, it's a Ukrainian lament, and it's called Pickhart. And it's basically, the translation loosely is about a son who's going off to war and a mother who is, speaking with him, and essentially it's a conversation about, he asks like, who will bury me when I die in a foreign land, and the song, the lament, was sang at the Maidan, after the Maidan deaths. They had a public funeral, and all of these, like, just thousands and thousands of people in the city center were carrying caskets through the city, and the song was being played and sung, and that was super moving to me. And I think that there's this strange juxtaposition of these people being, these protesters who were, fighting and speaking out against their government, and then ended up getting murdered in the street, and they're not dying in a foreign land, they're dying at home. And that was especially moving to me. And but still, the idea of having to fight for your home and having to take up arms and having to protect yourself, that was one of the guiding lights in this. And so, I'm trying to remember the second part of your question now. I'm so sorry, I'm really nervous. There's a lot of people here.
I feel like you covered it. I don't know.
I would say that also just with that, in terms of the grief and the trauma that each character kind of carries with them, and the fact that none of them are entirely from the place that they're in, they all have sort of ended up in Kiev. I think that part of that was a little bit intentional in the sense that each one of them is actually an orphan to some degree. They are missing a parent, don't know their parents. And I think that the unsettling part of that is to just finding out who you are, and going back to the story of this title, and a mother and son discussing this soldier who might not return home. It just spoke to the layers of emotional distress that we have. It's not even just going to Maidan. It's not just all of these people coming together and seeing this violence. It's this sort of violence that's going on internally too, and trying to heal past that. And yeah, so I think that there's a lot of layers that I was trying to get with this book, that it's not just trauma doesn't have to be this big thing that just sort of happens. It can be this quiet thing that you never even knew was there, you know, like Katya and never knowing her parents, you know, something like that, you know.
Well, I so appreciated the layers and layers and layers of this book. And I said it already, but those cause and effect sections for me, when you have your, you know, it's like it's your choice as a writer to have your characters thinking of their past grief on the page, and that just like was so poignant to me. So we've been talking a lot about sad things, and tragedies in this novel: displacement, grief, trauma, loss, woe. But there's a whole lot of hope actually in this novel. The women that returned to Chernobyl, I can't remember their names right now. So mostly, those women that returned, and they, you know, basically say, if you want us to leave, just basically bury us, right? Or, yeah. We have the protesters that show up day in and day out at Maidan. We have also a lot of pregnancies in the book. We have Vera, Jara, Katya, and then these moments of love, right, between Misha and Katya and Slava and Dasha. I want to read this line, I loved it so much, or lines. It was a strange thing, all those protesters huddled together, their government gone to shit, and they're singing. It had a magic to it, the Maidan, as much as it possessed a terror. I love those lines and the complexity of them. How do you see a sense of hope or resilience in your book, working within the context of the larger narrative?
Yes, definitely. I think that it would be, I think that like it kind of goes back to just the story of Maidan, and you know, it started off with just these young people like hid in the streets and just singing and, you know, dancing out there and, you know, painting faces and playing music, and they were protesting their government, but there was this joy in being together and finding connections. And one thing that I kept in the back of my mind writing this book was that I wanted there to be love, because I think that some of the greatest stories that I've read were, not only did they take place during times of war, but there was love in the midst of it. And I think that when you're going through something, whether it's, you know, your own Maidan, or whether it's, you know, just your daily drama, keeping that light on is just, I think, so much a part of who I am, that it didn't seem possible for me to write a book that was going to end in gloom. And even though there's a war going on in Ukraine, and many people are, you know, disillusioned by the government and all of these things, there's a lot of people who believe in their country and still, you know, do the work. And they're still trying to make their country a better place. There's a lot of, you know, talk with the EU. There's, they had in this, since the Euromaidan protests, they had their first like pride parade that, you know, there were LGBT communities were, you know, that's another part of the book, is that there's a lot of violence towards a community and disappearing people, and they're working really hard to eliminate that, or at least like have like a more accepting community. And I think that it's like the hope that kept me in the book and kept me wanting to write, and keeps me going as a writer.
I think that's a good place to end our part on acceptance and hope and finding love amidst all the tragedy. Would we like to move on to the Q&A portion of the night?